July the 8th, 2022. Today's NEADS webinar features Dr. Michael Prince and April Diabin from the Council of Canadians with Disabilities, and today we're talking about the Employment Equity Act. I'd like to open by welcoming everyone and turning it over to Frank Smith, our National Coordinator, to please give a land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Elizabeth. The National Educational Association of Disabled Students would like to begin this event by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. As settlers, we're grateful for the opportunity to meet here, and we thank all the generations of people who have taken care of this land for thousands of years. We are grateful to have the opportunity to present in this territory. We commit to continue to explore and make meaningful contributions to the calls to action that result from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. To learn more about land acknowledgements and reconciliation, you can visit www.native-land.ca. We will add a link to the chat.
Thank you very much, Frank. That's fantastic. Very important part of our events. And I'd like to now turn it over to my colleague and co-facilitator, Sarah, who will introduce today's guest speakers. Sarah, over to you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. As Elizabeth mentioned, with us today presenting are April Diabin and Michael Prince. April is a research analyst and coordinator for the Council of Canadians with Disabilities, and will be starting us off by giving us some history of the Employment Equity Act and the feelings and expectations people had surrounding it at the time that it was first implemented. After April, we'll be hearing from Michael Prince, a Lansdowne professor of social policy at the University of Victoria, who will be discussing the Employment Equity Act Review Task Force, the Accessible Canada Act, and other recent employment initiatives and policies. After this, we'll be opening things up for discussion and Q&A.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I would now like to welcome April, who will give our first presentation. April, over to you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I just want to say how exciting it is to see so many people come out on a Friday afternoon in July to have a conversation about employment equity, which the Equality and Employment Royal Commission described as a strategy designed to obliterate the effects of discrimination and to open equitably the competition for employment to those who have been arbitrarily excluded. Perhaps the interest in the discussion about employment equity is part due to
who's coming to the computer, sorry. I'll use my phone.
To the fact that this conversation is
So I've just muted everyone because there's some background noise, but April, I'll invite you to unmute yourself. Sorry about that. We were just getting a little bit of background noise there.
I believe the last time Employment Equity Act was reviewed was in 2002, despite the fact that the Act calls for a legislative review every 5 years. So we're somewhat overdue for this conversation, and it's really great that so many people have come out to join us on this discussion. And I want to acknowledge that we have employment equity as a result of the social justice work done by advocates in the 1980s and 90s in the disability community. Michael Huck from the Saskatchewan Voice of Persons with Disabilities and Carol McGregor of Disabled People for Employment Equity really led the way in making the calls for employment equity. And it's their shoulders that I am standing on, and appreciate all the heavy lifting they did back in that period on employment equity. And although we've been critical of some of the approaches to employment equity, I want to acknowledge that it's an important tool in our community toolkit, and it has resulted in some positive impact on the employment landscape. So it's a worthwhile endeavor that we're engaged in to work toward improving the Employment Equity Act. Last night, I was at a CCD Executive Committee meeting, and Pat Danforth, who's here with us today, made the point that it takes time to make positive social change, and it's important to keep at it and showing up to the occasions where we can hope to make some improvements. So I'm happy that we're all here showing up to work on employment equity. At the Council of Canadians with Disabilities, we've had a long history with first affirmative action and then with employment equity as it came to be known. And I'm going to share some of that history with you so that you can contextualize the current work on employment equity. Getting better access to employment was one of the factors that motivated people with disabilities in the 1970s to organize cross-disability groups that eventually banded together to form CCD. And disability activists were aware of what was happening elsewhere to improve employment for persons with disabilities, such as the Affirmative Action Program that was established under the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 in the US. Activists used available opportunities to push for measures that would address the employment and underemployment of people with disabilities living in Canada. At that time, it was estimated that about 50% of people with disabilities were unemployed. In 1981, the UN established the International Year of Persons with Disabilities, and the federal government's response to that was the Special Parliamentary Committee on Persons with Disabilities. And organizations like CCD turned out en masse to educate the parliamentarians about the concerns of people with disabilities, and the lack of employment was a big one that was stressed. And as a result, the obstacles report, which was issued by the Special Parliamentary Committee in recommendation 19, called for the federal government to require all department agencies and crown corporations to expand or implement affirmative action programs. According to the obstacles report, at that time, there were only 3 departments that had undertaken an affirmative action program: Employment and Immigration, Secretary of State, and Treasury Board. And the program was focused on women, Indigenous persons, and persons with disabilities. However, people with what was then termed a mental disability were excluded. Obstacles was a watershed moment for people with disabilities and the disability rights movement. Just like today, as we're trying to get the articles of the convention implemented, back in the 80s, we were trying to get the 130 obstacles recommendations fulfilled. In June of 1983, the Honorable Lloyd Axworthy, who was then the Minister of Employment and Immigration, established the Royal Commission on Equality in Employment with Judge Rosalie Abella as its commissioner. This was seen by the disability community as another important opportunity to push on affirmative action. The Commission's terms of reference mandated it to inquire into the most efficient and effective and equitable means of promoting employment opportunities for and eliminating systemic discrimination against 4 designated groups: women, Indigenous persons, persons with disabilities, and racialized people. For the disability community, the Commission was an opportunity to breathe life into obstacles recommendation number 19 on affirmative action. The Commission did its own research on the employment situation in Canada. For example, it tried to examine the labor force profiles of the groups it was studying, but it found there were no comprehensive national data available on persons with disabilities, which I think is a telling indicator of how much attention had been paid to the employment of persons with disabilities up to that point. The Commission sent out about 3,000 letters inviting participation in its work to the groups that it was studying, as well as engaging with the public via media. Organizations like CCD were keen to appear, and spoke about the barriers that people with disabilities encountered in the workforce. I think Judge Abella heard the concerns. For example, the Commission's report stated that unless we reject arbitrary distinctions, these four groups will remain unjustifiably in perpetual slow motion. The objectives of breathing life into the notion of equality are to rectify as quickly as possible the results of parochial perspectives which unfairly restrict women, Native people, disabled persons, and visible minorities. For disabled persons, there must be as full accommodation as possible and the widest range of human and technical supports. Workplaces must, in all respects, be physically accessible. Flexible working arrangements must be available for those unable to work long hours. Attendance and technical aid should be available for those who require them, and the necessary tax adjustments must be available both to employers and disabled employees. Pension and benefit schemes must be adjusted so as to encourage disabled persons to join the workplace, and transportation systems must be adequate to permit access to workplaces. In its final report, the Commission rejected voluntary measures. It recommended a statutory requirement to implement employment equity that would oblige employers to develop and maintain practices designed to eliminate discriminatory barriers in the workplace. It called for legislation to identify the areas where employers and unions would be expected to adjust their practices. The Commission recommended the collection of measurement data to track progress. It called for the creation of an enforcement agency. It also recommended contract compliance, stating, in the absence of legislation requiring all employers to implement employment equity, the federal government should encourage employment equity in the private sector by the use of contract compliance. Contract compliance means government will agree to purchase goods and services only from businesses that agree to implement employment equity. The Honorable Flora MacDonald, Minister of Employment and Immigration in the Conservative Mulroney government, answer to the Royal Commission was the Employment Equity Act, which was passed in 1986 and took effect in 1987. People with disabilities were included in the 1986 Employment Equity Act, as were Indigenous persons, racialized people, and women. The act was inclusive of those with physical, mental, psychiatric, sensory, or learning disabilities, considered themselves to be or believed an employer or potential employer would consider them disadvantaged in employment by reason of disability, and identified themselves to an employer or agreed to be identified by an employer as a person with a disability. A significant gap in coverage was that 2S LGBTQA+ persons were not included as a designated group. The 1986 Act was criticized by people with disabilities and people from other communities as well. The commentary of the day was that we wanted an employment act, and we wanted an employment equity act with teeth. Focus of the act was on collecting data and what missing was meaningful sanctions for employers who were not making progress on employing designated group member in representative numbers. Organizations are continuing to make the same call. I just looked at the website of the Public Service Alliance of Canada website. There was an announcement that PSAC is pressing for an Employment Equity Act with T. I don't know how many press releases I've written myself over the years that have said the same thing. We're looking for an Employment Equity Act with teeth. In 1992, Jerry McDonald, a representative of CCD, appeared before a parliamentary committee that was reviewing the Employment Equity Act, and he criticized, in Canada, it is clear after 5 years of employment equity, virtually no progress made in the area of acquisition of permanent full-time employment in the federally regulated workforce by people with disabilities. The 1995 updating of the Act did not provide the teeth that the groups had been calling for. Since its creation, the Act's enforcement and sanctions for non-compliance have been ineffective. Employers face fines for poor reporting, but no sanctions for failing to develop, implement, and achieve employment equity plans and goals. I believe it is less than 10-12% of employers that are covered by the Employment Equity Act. So one of our advocacy agenda items needs to be getting more employers covered by employment equity requirements. If you will recall, Bob Rae's government passed employment equity legislation in Ontario, but that was appealed by the Harris government. But if it was done once, we can get it done again. So with all of us here working together, I hope that this time around, with this modernization effort of the current government, we will get the Employment Equity Act with teeth that groups have been calling for many years. Back to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, April. That was a really great overview. You've given us lots to think about, taken us through some of that history, and kind of helped us see how we got to the point we're at today. So now, to pick up from that, I'd like to invite Dr. Michael Prince to talk a little bit about what the Act is like today, and a little bit about how it does or does not align with the Accessible Canada Act. And I will invite you to start now, Dr. Prince.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you very much, April. You've done a wonderful job in reminding us of some of the history in the past, and as only you and people at CCD could do. And before I begin my formal remarks, I want to just acknowledge that this week the disability rights movement and the disability community in Canada lost a giant. Jim Dirksen, a longtime volunteer and leader with CCD, passed away suddenly earlier this week, and I just wanted to acknowledge that formally at this event. He was a visionary leader. There's a wonderful statement that April has posted at the CCD online site, if you want to go read it and learn more about Jim's work. I know many of you worked and knew Jim, and it's a great loss to the movement, and great sympathies to his family this week. So God bless you, Jim. Okay, I'd like to just, you see the first slide, you see the outline. So in the next about 12 minutes or so, I want to talk about the fact that the Employment Equity Act, as April mentioned, is under formal review for the first time in a generation. And so and as April said, in the Act, there's a provision that it be reviewed every 5 years. And it's quite interesting that it was not reviewed during the Stephen Harper years in 2007 and in 2012. And it was due for a review around 2017, although that didn't happen either. And part of it, quite frankly, from my opinion, is a concern that if the Act had been reviewed during those years, during fairly conservative political times, the Act was vulnerable to being even watered down more and not strengthened, but in fact compromised. So the time has been lost for that, but that was a strategic, I think, calculation by many in social justice groups and in the employment equity community, that the time was risky and dangerous to do that. But I think we're in a different place today. with a different government and a different opportunity to think about how to strengthen and advance and modernize the Employment Equity Act. So what I'm going to want to talk about briefly is some of the employment initiatives that currently exist for Canadians with disabilities in two regards, and then talk a bit about the Employment Equity Act and how it compares and aligns with the recently passed Accessible Canada Act of 2019. So if we could go to the next slide, please, that would be appreciated. Or can I do that? Or
Are you
Frank?
seeing the next slide?
Next slide. Yeah, next slide, please.
Are you seeing the slide?
It's not advancing on my screen.
Okay, hold on.
That's okay. There we go. Thank you.
Got it now?
So, yep. So this slide looks at employment initiatives for persons with disabilities, and particularly federal programs that relate directly to other governments, provincial and territorial governments, to civil society organizations, nonprofits and others, and to the private sector. And I just want to highlight four key initiatives with respect to this topic. And one is just to remind people of the workforce development agreements, which is the current and latest generation of federal transfer payments to the provinces and territories in the area of labor market programming. And the funding currently is around $5.2 billion over 6 years for employment and skills training. And that includes, according to the federal government, specific targeted funding for persons with disabilities. And I think that's a work in progress. I think if you were to ask your respective provincial departments or ministries of employment or labor, what funding is going specifically for people with disabilities, you might find a difficult answer to get or not as clear as it should be. So I think that's a work in progress. There used to be a dedicated program for persons with disabilities, which got folded up into these agreements. So that's an interesting challenge to make sure that funding actually does get directed to persons with disabilities. There also federally, there's the Enabling Accessibility Fund, which got a new boost of money in the 2021 federal budget for 2 years to advance for more accessible workplaces. It's unfortunate that often these announcements are for 1 or 2 years rather than sort of new, sustained, ongoing funding. And I hope that going forward, that would be something that we would see more permanent and significant ongoing funding through that fund. The Opportunities Fund as well, as many of you know, has been around a long time. And similarly, it often gets new investments of money into it, but usually, again, for time-limited periods. And so, although the Opportunities Fund is now being portrayed as part of the federal government's Disability Inclusion Action Plan, one of its pillars is a more robust employment strategy for persons with disabilities throughout the country. I also just want to note that the Canada Workers Benefit, which is a refundable tax credit program targeted for low-income workers, has, as you may well know, a disability supplement attached to it. And there's been some important enhancements and improvements to that benefit in terms of how many people will qualify for it and how much money they will get in terms of support that was rolled out in the last federal budget and this year. In fact, the Deputy Prime Minister talked about this recently in her statements with regard to improving the affordability of living in Canada in the face of increasing inflation. So next slide, if we can, Frank. We can turn to the next slide. And what it points to is initiatives for persons with disabilities, specifically in or within the federal public service itself. And this chart talks, first of all, about a couple of targets. One is a promise made a few years ago now about hiring 5,000 persons with disabilities in the federal public service by the year 2025. And again, I'm not sure how clear or transparent the monitoring is of that and how that information is being reported out, but that's something that we need to look to and pay close attention to. The other target is to have, currently there's about a little over 5% of federal employees identify as having a disability. Now, what's interesting also is that the number of new hires in recent years into the federal public service only about 4% of people who are recent recruits into the federal public service self-identify as a person with a disability. So this target of 7% may not seem high, but in terms of recent trends of hiring, it almost means a doubling of who's coming into the federal public service as identifying as having a disability. And then there's a whole host of measures. There's a centralized enabling workplace fund, which has $10 million over 5 years to help enhance accessibility. The federal internship program for Canadians with disabilities, the federal student work experience program, and this review of the Employment Equity Act, which was announced last summer in July of 2021 by the federal government and is intended to be wrapped up or completed by sometime this fall of 2022. If we could go to the next slide, please, Frank. I'm just giving people kind of a quick high-level overview so we can leave time for questions and answers later. I was asked to compare or talk a little bit about comparing the Employment Equity Act, which is, April reminded us, is a product of the advocacy of the late 1970s, early 1980s, and the Accessible Canada Act, which similarly has a long history of advocacy going back at least to the early 1990s, on and off by some groups, culminating with some provincial laws from Ontario in 2005 and Manitoba in 2013, Nova Scotia in 2017, the Federal Act 2019, BC passed one in 2021. So it's been a journey too of reforms. So just to note some of the commonalities or features that these two pieces of legislation share. One is that they are in fact statutory. And as April said, this was a key part in the advocacy around employment equity, that this be mandatory. This not be something nice to do or voluntary or nice to have, but it would actually be the law of the land, the law of the jurisdiction. And this came from advocacy by disability rights groups that April mentioned and other social movements. Both pieces of legislation operate within and limit to, but by and large, the federal jurisdiction, federal constitutional responsibilities, including the federally regulated private sector. And that primarily relates to industries or sectors like banking, broadcasting, interprovincial transportation, and telecommunications, and a few other activities. And I think April mentioned somewhere around between 9 to 12% of the labor force is covered by those federally regulated private sectors. In other words, the bulk of the Canadian labor force is not covered by these laws. They both function within a larger human rights framework. Prior to their being created, there was the Canadian Human Rights Act, which was passed in the 1970s, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which was entrenched in 1982. And that led very much to the Abella report that April talked about that informed the initial Employment Equity Act of 1986. More recently, for the Accessible Canada Act, there was the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which Canada signed on to in 2010. Both acts adopt what's called a proactive and a systemic or systematic approach to addressing barriers and discrimination and advancing change. That's to contrast with a more traditional approach of an individual-based, case-by-case complaint process, it was historically the approach done in human rights laws and anti-discrimination laws that Canadian jurisdictions had introduced from the 1940s on through into the 1980s and 90s. So this is meant to be more proactive, not just sitting and waiting for people to bring complaints where the burden then and the onus is on individuals, but to put the responsibility on governments to do this in a more systematic way. And both acts impose obligations on regulated entities. And they both have various references to compliance, enforcement, and implementation, though I would agree with April that there's more attention given to compliance in the Accessible Canada Act than there is in the Employment Equity Act. And I think that in part is because of the experiences and disappointments with the Employment Equity Act, that the Accessible Canada Act needed more teeth. And that really was informed by that critique and lessons learned from the Employment Equity Act. And both rely on the Canadian Human Rights Commission as a key monitoring and enforcement agency and both work through Employment and Social Development Canada as a federal organization. So if we turn to the next slide, Frank, please. Here are just some brief remarks on some of the differences, having looked at some of the commonalities, some of the differences. First of all, just their history. One, the Employment Equity Act, of course, again, a product of a different time in the early 1980s. One wonders that if there wasn't the constitutional debate going on at the time, and also the International Year of Disabled Persons that led to the Obstacles Report, whether we would have had something like the Employment Equity Act actually entrenched with the 4 designated groups that April mentioned. April also mentioned that the Employment Equity Act applies to federal contractors or the contract compliance program. And that's really important because that extends the reach of the Employment Equity Act well beyond just traditional federally regulated sectors to organizations like my own, the University of Victoria. So post-secondary educations across the country, colleges, technical institutes, but also all the universities, all 70 plus universities, operate under the Employment Equity Act because we receive funding and research grants from federal government agencies. So we need to comply with the Act. So that is a very important dimension to the Employment Equity Act that isn't present with the Accessible Canada Act. The Employment Equity Act, 4 designated groups, obviously the Accessible Canada Act, primarily 1 disability designated group, perhaps understood in a more diverse way. Perhaps the notion of an understanding of disability is broader under the Accessible Canada Act, and certainly specifically refers to intersectionality and intersectional barriers and disadvantages. So perhaps a more modern use of language in the way of thinking about the groups that need assistance. The Employment Equity Act, of course, is focused on employment. Accessible Canada Act has a wider concept of barriers. Now, having said that, the Abella Royal Commission report talked a lot about other programs and measures that needed to be undertaken to complement the Act itself. So although she knew the Act was going to be mainly regulatory and about standards and plans and about employment barriers, she saw the need for investments in other measures, whether it was in childcare or in training or in education or accessible transportation and housing. So there was a whole wraparound of other social and public programs that Judge Abella saw were absolutely essential to the success of the Employment Equity Act. And one could say, not unfairly, that that second part of her vision of employment equity never took off in the way that I think she envisaged. And also the Act perhaps wasn't as robust and rigorous as she had envisioned or hoped, and certainly as the disability rights movement had hoped. So although I say that the Accessible Canada Act has a broader view of barriers, it too is implicitly based on an assumption that for it to work, it needs to be supported by a wraparound of other supports and services for Canadians with disabilities and other Canadians in general. The other last thing I just want to note about the Accessible Canada Act, it actually has a target date. There are no end dates in the employment equity legislation. There may be short-term, maybe even medium-term targets that are sometimes talked about in employment equity plans, but there's no destination on the journey. There's no estimated time of arrival as to when we will achieve the objectives. But what you'll see in the Ontario legislation on accessibility and in Nova Scotia and in the federal legislation is a stated date. The original draft of the bill of the Accessible Canada Act avoided specifying a date. When the bill went through the House of Commons and Senate, it got amended by the lobbying efforts of the disability rights groups to say, we want a date. And it got amended and it was accepted and passed by Parliament. So we have this date of January 2040 of saying a barrier-free Canada in federal jurisdictions. Very interesting with some monitoring. Okay, we could go to the last slide. Again, this is just a brief update about the task force. This was announced last summer by the Trudeau government. It's an arm's length or independent task force. There's 12 members of it. At least one is a person with disabilities who also sits on Minister Qualtrough's advisory group on disability. And there's an implicit admission, I think, that while there has been some success, a lot of workers still face barriers to employment and retention and advancement or promotion through the workforce. Many federal workplaces continue to fall short of reflecting the full diversity of the population. And that's an interesting phrase that the government's using, reflect the full diversity, because there's a sense that the act will be amended to expand the number of designated groups beyond the 4 that were first identified by Judge Abella in the early 1980s and were enshrined in the legislation in 1986, and then the subsequent act that was amended in 1995, that other equity-seeking groups or justice-seeking groups will get identified in an updated piece of legislation. So the task force is, in short, being asked to look at how to improve accountability, compliance, and enforcement, which is a key issue that has dogged this legislation since the outset. How to improve public reporting and transparency again, and how to better support equity groups. And again, this is this issue of the full diversity of how can racialized communities, perhaps LGBTQ plus and other groups be protected under this legislation or updated. So a report is expected to be submitted to the Deputy Minister of Labor later this fall through the Minister. That will get released, I assume, sometime before the end of this year. And that will then lead to, I would think, a parliamentary process of discussion in 2023 with hearings. So some disability groups have had an opportunity this spring and summer to be consulted. It's not the last opportunity. I expect there will be another process next fall, or no, next year at some point. It could be next fall, 2023, where there will be parliamentary hearings and proposed amendments to the Employment Equity Act. Again, disability rights groups and others I know will be part of that process. So I will stop there and turn it back to you, Elizabeth. And thank you, Frank, for your help.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Michael. That was a great overview. I just wanted to kind of pause for a minute and ask some questions to Michael and April. And this one I'll throw open to both of you. To what extent, or in your opinion, do you think the Employment Equity Act incorporates persons with disabilities in its legislation? Maybe we'll start with you, April, and then move to Michael.
Yes, the people with disabilities are amongst the designated groups. So yes, they have been included.
Yeah,
great. Michael, do you want to add? Yeah.
Absolutely. I think April very nicely. I think she understates what she said earlier in her fantastic earlier remarks. That there was a lot of strong advocacy around the Employment Equity Act, as there was around the Charter of Rights, to make sure that Canadians with mental and physical disabilities, as we tended to say those two phrases 40 years ago, be acknowledged. And I think Judge Abella was greatly impressed by the advocacy and the presentations and submissions made by disability activists and groups at the time. And but looking back now, of the 4 designated groups, if you look at the annual equity reports put out by the Government of Canada for representation, the group that's achieved the least success or the most modest success are Canadians with disabilities. And I think experience would suggest that people with disabilities who have benefited with the Employment Equity Act have been people who are already employed or were within the labor force. So there are major challenges that continue. And we know also that every year through the Human Rights Commission, the single largest category of complaints about discrimination are on the grounds of disabilities. So these, we go back to one of the phrases that April read out by Judge Abella about perpetual slow motion. And I think that's probably one phrase that we could say today. We could quote Judge Abella 40 years later and say, that still that's still a fairly appropriate phrase to describe the experience of a lot of Canadians with disabilities in terms of what they had hoped or anticipated might be the success of the Employment Equity Act.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. And, just to kind of tail off that, what, in terms of just thinking through the act, in your view, how could the Employment Equity Act better support persons with disabilities in its legislation and frameworks? And I'll start with April and then go to Michael. We're not hearing you, April. I don't know if you're
Sorry,
on.
I think I forgot to take myself off.
No worries. Do you want me to repeat the question?
Sure, that would be
Sure, not at all. So in your view, how could the Employment Equity Act better support workers with disabilities?
I think if it could be helpful to improve the act by requiring disaggregated data for subgroups and intersectionality, so that we have a better idea of how intersecting communities of people with disabilities are faring in employment.
Great, thank you. And Michael, anything to add to that?
Okay, one of the hopes around employment equity for all the groups, all 4 groups, but I, speaking of specifically people with disabilities, is the concept of critical mass. That for employment equity to really work, you want inclusive workplaces, and you just don't want 1 or 2 token representatives of a group say, oh, tick the box. We've got our 2 people with disability. They work down the hall or over there. Particularly in certain higher levels of the organizations, in professional and senior management and executive levels, there's still significant underrepresentation. So there's a lack of role models. There's a lack of mentors. The current Deputy Minister of Public Service Accessibility, Yasmin Laroche, has said, one of her goals is to make sure that she's not going to be the only visibly disabled Deputy Minister in the public service of Canada. As long as she is, there's a sense of A, we've done it, or B, tokenism. And so there needs to be substantial cultural change along with a more concerted effort. And as I hinted at earlier, Elizabeth, a lot of these initiatives for funding are time limited. They're like pilot projects. They're 2-year, 3-year. This is an ongoing project. The fact that we're modernizing a piece of legislation that has a history of at least 40 years, and we know that the results are modest at best, this is a generational commitment. This deserves, significant funding over decades, not just a 2-year, 3-year commitment at this budget or that for a little announcement. So, and a reappreciation of the message that came out of the Abella report, that you need accessible high schools and education. You need accessible colleges. We need better transitions for people into employment. I mean, behind the employment equity is the employment barriers more generally, as you well know. We need to kind of really talk about labor market policies as well. But I realize this is a piece of legislation that pertains to just 10 or 12% of the federal Canadian labor force. But if the federal government can become a model employer, which it still falls short of, I think that's still an important concept to support and work towards, and continue to persist on that. And so there's work to do. But I totally agree with April. We need better disaggregated data as to how groups are faring, and then drawing lessons from that, and better sharing of practices across federal departments. We don't need to reinvent the wheel constantly on this. We need far better ongoing conversations about what works, how it works, and moving forward on, again, getting better representation all the way up to the top of the hierarchies across the whole federal public service.
Thank you so much. I think I'll ask one more question, and then we'll open it up to our audience. But it was based on something you just said around sort of targets and thinking about the federal government's commitment to hire 5,000 persons with disabilities. What steps do you feel need to be taken to promote an inclusive recruitment and hiring process? And maybe I'll just leave it open to whomever would like to answer that last question.
Well, I'll go first, so April has some time to think, because you've been putting her on the spot first. So I'll jump ahead if that's okay, April. I think one is that we need accountability. You know, we need to hold, to use an old phrase, hold the feet to the fire, in the sense of deputy ministers and ministers and others need to be held accountable on the results or lack thereof for hitting this target. You know, about 10 years ago, we made a similar commitment for Canadian veterans. We did it also many years ago. After World War II, we made a commitment to Canadian veterans, and we hired thousands of them into the federal public service. We made a similar commitment about 10 years ago to the veterans of Afghanistan and the veterans of other wars and peacekeeping missions of the 1990s. And you know what? We failed to meet that commitment. And if we can't make it for veterans, for God's sakes, I don't feel very confident we're going to hit it for Canadians with disabilities. So we need accountability, we need reporting, and we need consequences, so that if a deputy minister does not achieve a target in his or her department, there's some consequences and there's some transparency. Otherwise, I think we miss these things, and they silently go away or get forgotten. So we need a bright light of openness and transparency, and we need rewards, but also penalties. So back to enforcement and compliance, Elizabeth, I think we need to kind of put a pressure on here in a polite way, but in a professional way. But we need to hold people accounting for these commitments.
Thank you so much. I completely agree. And April, do you have any last final thoughts on that question around sort of targets and inclusive hiring and recruitment processes?
I think in addition to hiring and recruitment, we need to have robust policies and practices that make people with disabilities want to stay in those jobs and have the opportunity to have upward career progression. A lot of times, I think you see people with disabilities joining a particular workplace, but the culture within the workplace may be so ableist that it is not a pleasant space for people with disabilities to remain. So they leave. I know in one of the presentations Max Yalden made to one of the reviews, early reviews of the Employment Equity Act, he commented how despite the Employment Equity Act, there was an outflow of people with disabilities. There were fewer people employed with disabilities in that workforce than when the act started. So I think it's important to address ableism within those workforces.
For
and
sure.
I think Michael made an important point about the critical mass. You know, when you get, if you're the only one maybe in a particular unit or workforce, it can be an uncomfortable place to be. But if there are more people present, then I think it's easier for the individual, and it will have an impact on the ableist nature of the workforce. And I think managers need to have there's an obligation for managers to address ableism in their workforces.
For sure. Thank you so much. Those are such great points, but I do want to stop us there to open it up to the audience. And I want to invite anybody who'd like to post questions in the chat. I see we've got one already, which I'll read out in a moment, or raise your hand. So we're going to start with Sherry. And Sherry's question is about the 50% unemployment rate for youth with disabilities and what the government, federal government, can do to ensure our futures. And then after we hear the answer to Sherry's question, Heather will be next, because I see Heather raised her hand, or their hand. So Michael or April, any thoughts?
Yes, happy to. The federal government, and I want to thank Frank for reminding me of some of the initiatives that the federal government does that are targeted at both high school students, and also college and post-secondary students. Overall, so I think, continue on those major investments. I think the main heavy lifting on that in really lowering that high unemployment rate for youth with disabilities is the role of the provinces. So that comes back to this question of the billions of dollars that the federal government is transferring to the provinces. And we hardly hear any talk of this. We hear a lot about federal funding for healthcare. And the federal government needs to put more money in healthcare. We hear a lot about equalization payments. We hardly ever hear about the federal transfer payments to the provinces for education and employment for young people. And again, it's a tricky proposition, but it puts the burden on disability groups to advocate and be active province by province, territory by territory. But Frank does a great job, but we need a continued national conversation on scaling up positive practices that work to chip away at youth with disabilities. COVID, as you all know, has had a hard impact on employment. Overall, the employment rate in Canada has bounced back to pre-COVID levels statistically for the population as a whole. But from what I've seen in BC, it has not bounced back for young people with disabilities, particularly people I work with in community living, people with intellectual or developmental disabilities. Their unemployment rates are still very high, and it is a struggle. Despite all the talk about labor shortage and people looking for workers, those barriers, those ableist practices that April mentioned are there still. So there's a lot of work to do. To quote the great Pat Danforth that April mentioned, it takes time to achieve these important social changes. We got to stick at it and work towards those positive results. So I just hope we don't go into a recession in the next year or two that is going to make this even more challenging. But we are subject to the ups and downs of our economy, and people are now focused more on issues of inflation than they are about employment. And so it's going to be harder, I think, rather than easier. I don't want to be pessimistic, but the challenge there before us is quite challenging. But we cannot, and I think politicians hear this part of the message, we cannot condemn another young generation to a future of unemployment and social assistance or shelter
That's great.
workshops.
Michael, I'm going to leave you there just because we've got so many hands up.
Okay.
Thank you so much. And thanks so much for that, Sherry. And Heather, you were next. And then Frank, once Heather's done asking their question, if I can get you to read the next hand that's up, that would be great. So Heather, over to you.
Elizabeth Muller.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. My big issue around all of this is in the ableist power imbalance. When we talk about ableist practices, one of the ways that the community has said these things over and over and over again, but no tangible result that is sustainable. It will be, as Michael and others have said, little pockets of money for 1, 2, or 3 years, but nothing that really looks at the long-term impact of what will make change permanent. And when I talk about a power imbalance, I'm very concerned that we keep asking the government to do the work on our behalf, and we push them, and although it's their responsibility, they should be reporting back to us, and we should be giving them a report card on how well they're doing, and start inviting them to our tables and saying, okay, said this, you didn't do it, we will give you 2 years. and if you don't get it together, then, we will take it over and you will fund us as high as you fund yourself to do the job. Like, we need to switch the power imbalance. We need to have it our table, because all of this is about us. And all we have done is allowed them, or not all we have done, but one of the things they have done is made a charity model. We've got the issue of not being brought into society. They say, okay, we will look after it for you. We will deal with it. And then we go home, and the next morning we wake up and it's just as bad sometimes as it was. So we really need to be an active force in being equal power sharing at the table when they decide to make these decisions. It isn't about just consultation. It's meaningful consultation and power sharing at the table. And if we look at the preamble of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, it's very clear that any policies, we must be at the table as equal partners to decide if those are the ones that will work.
Right.
So I just wanted to bring that forward.
Thank you. Yeah, completely agree, Heather. Nothing about us without us. And I'm feeling bad. I have to be the bad guy to cut people off because we did start a few moments late due to the internet and technology. I'm going to let us go for, I think, 4 more minutes. So Frank, could you maybe read out the next hand that's on our screen? Because we had a couple of hands up.
Noah had his hand up.
Noah, yes, go ahead. What's your question, Noah?
Thank you very much, everybody. Good to hear everybody. I'm from Nunavut, at the provinces and territories. Great discussion we're talking about, and we're talking about equity, access, and as well as justice. I'm wondering as well. I know we mentioned earlier about provincial, so provinces and territories. I'm wondering, again, are we going to be part of the process of engaging in this betterment or understanding more of better access or equitable access? Because as of right now, we're talking about 25 communities up here in Nunavut, and as well as in the other provinces and urban communities, whereas we're talking about across Canada. How can we equally be part of this, as well as, you know, we're discussing about a significant amount of funding, and the further you go, the funding needs to be bigger. So how can we make this better, and at least we all can achieve one task altogether? Thank you.
Just if I can respond to Noah, and nice to see you, Noah. Noah and I are on an Inclusion Canada committee as well, where we've talked about some of these issues. I think when I mentioned earlier in my presentation, Noah, about the fact that the Government of Canada claims that in their transfer payments to provinces and territories under the workforce development agreements, that there's dedicated or specific funding that will go to persons with disabilities. You know, it's really up to the Government of Canada and respective territorial or provincial government to say, how can we track that money? Let's show us the visibility. How much is going in your jurisdiction to persons with disabilities? The concern or suspicion that some of us have is that the money is less than what Canadians with disabilities were getting under previous transfer arrangements. And if that's the case, because the money that was coming under the previous arrangements hadn't been really increased for over a decade. In other words, there was really no significant new investments to persons with disabilities through those federal, provincial, territorial transfer arrangements since probably the early 2000s. And that's shocking. That really shows a lack of priority or commitment. And now with this new agreement, where it's even harder to track the dollars, I think it's not unreasonable that we're suspicious and saying, show us the money, show us almost a forensic audit. Like, let's show us how we track the money, who's getting it for what kind of training, what kind of skills development, what kind of opportunities. And as April said, not only obtaining jobs, job retention, and, you know, and upgrading and allowing people to move up into other, you know, to think about a career, not just a job, you know, and all that. So I think there's an obligation on governments to be open and accountable. And I think Heather said that as well. You know, and nothing about us without us, and clarity around that. Thanks for your question, buddy.
Great questions, Noah and everyone. I think just to be mindful of time, we are going to have to wrap there the formal part, although if folks do want to stay on after we stop the recording and chat, you're more than welcome to do that. I see
If I
Pat
could
had,
just- Elizabeth, I wonder if we could just add something quickly here before we wrap
Sure.
up. And we did start late and we're right at the hour point, and I know our interpreters have to leave soon too, or maybe have left already. So I'll try to keep this short, but I just want to say that one thing that I think is really encouraging as an organization that represents post-secondary students and graduates with disabilities, and as a proud CCD member group, and very thrilled to be able to collaborate with CCD and Michael and April on this event. We are seeing actually quite a lot of movement from federal government departments across the federal public service with reach outs to our organization. This includes crown corporations as well, like Canada Post. They're indicating to us that they want to be able to promote opportunities within their departments, and how is it that we can help provide them with what they call a talent pipeline of educated persons with disabilities who can take on these roles. Like, for example, as the federal government is talking about hiring an additional 5,000 persons with disabilities by 2025, as Michael pointed out and April did as well. That seems like actually a fairly small number of people when you consider how many thousands of people work within the federal public service. And we also have to recognize that many people, as we mentioned earlier, are leaving federal government jobs out of frustration and through discrimination. I think there is some encouraging news on the horizon, and I feel like with a renewed and remodeled and representative Employment Equity Act, and with the Accessible Canada Act having some teeth across the federally regulated sector, that we could be in a lot better position. I just want to mention two other things.
sorry, Frank, the interpreters do have to go. So I don't know if maybe we can chat, after the recording is stopped, but I just want to be mindful of that.
Yeah, I just want to finish up with something here quickly. So the on the subject of hiring up, the federal government needs to hire up clearly, as do all employers across the country of persons with disabilities. But there's also the issue, and I'm wondering if Michael, and this may not be interpreted, but I wanted to just speak to it because it's important. I wondered if Michael or April could address the issue of, so with employment equity, the Employment Equity Act, and with any kind of data collection that's being done, and that includes through StatsCan surveys, it's reliant upon self-reporting, right? So I feel like there are lots of people with disabilities within federal government departments and in federal roles who are afraid to self-identify because they think there might be consequences for that, particularly those folks with episodic disabilities or invisible disabilities of a sort, whether mental health or learning disabilities or other various kinds of episodic disabilities, including chronic pain, who feel like they can't self-identify even if they're told the survey is anonymous, because there might be consequences with their manager, their director, whatever. They may be demoted or they may be discriminated against. So I wonder, and this may be beyond our time here, but I just thought it was important to address if April or Michael could speak to that whole issue around self-identification, because we're hearing a lot from a lot of people. I work in a federal government job in this department at a very low level. I'm afraid to self-identify my disability. I would actually like to have some accommodations, but I'm afraid to self-identify to receive the accommodations that would make me more successful in my job. So maybe just to speak to that, and I'm sorry if I went over, but I thought I'd bring those things up.
And I'm sorry, this is Andrew, the interpreter. Both Amber and I do need to leave. We have other jobs that we will be attending late for. So I apologize and good luck with the remainder of your meeting. Thank you.
Thank you to our interpreters. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, Frank, I have to leave because I also have another appointment.
Okay. Maybe Michael, you could certainly understand that. Michael, you could address that.
Yeah, I'm happy if Elizabeth, or if we're now, so we're officially off the meeting, but continue to chat. Elizabeth, I'm happy to stay for a few minutes.
The recording is still on.
Okay.
Okay. My thinking was you'd answer your question, then we can stop the recording, and
Okay.
I know at that time folks want, so
And
why don't we do that?
My apologies for extending it too long.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Let me get through this a little bit.
Yeah, and we do have lots of questions, so maybe we can do that sort of informally when the recording stops.
Yeah. Well, absolutely, Frank. There's a long research literature on this, as well as you just said. There's long personal stories and wisdom and narratives of people about the pros and cons, or the benefits and risks of self-identification. And even the whole question of disclosure, whether even in applying for a job, or should I include it in my resume? Should I mention it in the initial job interview? And we've had studies show that if people who do declare it even in resumes, less likely to get an interview, right? There's that sort of evidence. And polls have shown consistently, when Canadians get surveyed on this, a recognition that particularly people with mental health issues and conditions say, hell no, I wouldn't disclose. That would be the end of my career. Or I would lose any opportunities for promotion or advancement, or the respect of my coworker, whatever. There's another one I've been hearing, which is that managers who approach staff saying, please self-identify, it'll help us tick the boxes in our reporting plans to meet our numbers. So suddenly I can proudly report that our unit has 3 people with disabilities, and last year we only had 1. And so does it really change anything? It's the same people, but suddenly, so there's a sense of gentle coercion that some people feel, being pressured by a supervisor or manager in a highly inappropriate and it's probably illegal, offending the Human Rights Act and its protections for people. So you're right, this is a very tricky area. So again, it just reminds me of the need, and this is going to take a long time. It's back to those ableist practices that people have mentioned today. How do we get to a place where people, it's no longer seen as risky to your career or risky to yourself? So I understand the reluctance. I absolutely get it. I understand the resistance. These data sets are only as good as that whole dynamic about the pros and cons of self-identification. And we can say, as a statistician, don't worry, they're anonymous and your name will never come out. Well, that doesn't reassure people in their everyday work practices. And also a recent survey of the Federal Public Service showed that federal employees with disabilities consistently report higher levels of stress and lower levels of psychological well-being at work than their colleagues without disabilities. So again, to me, that tells us, the numbers, it's not just a numbers game, right? It's about the culture and it's about the social fabric of the workplace. And that tells me we've got a long way to go.
Thank you so much, Michael, for that. That was, all really good points. I think here we'll stop the recording and thank everybody for coming and for a